Accurate and deep reporting on any topic requires an understanding of the rules of the game. And perhaps no other part of the democratic process was scrutinized more following the chaotic 2020 election than how Americans vote. In the past 4 years, lawmakers have introduced hundreds of proposals that sought to either restrict or expand access to the polls. We're fortunate to have what I see as a fearsome foursome of folks to outline the new rules of the game for 2024, along with some valuable resources to help enrich your reporting. Sean Morales-Doyle is the director of the Voting Rights Program at the Brennan Center's Democracy Program. Please welcome Sean. Michigan State Senator Stephanie Chang is a member of the State Elections and Ethics Committee. Welcome to Senator Chang. Ian McDougall flew here from London, so especially welcome Ian, who's president of the LexisNexis Rule of Law Foundation and the U.S. Voting Laws and Legislation Center. Welcome to Ian. And our panel will be moderated today by Senator Jeremy Moss. The senator is chairman of the Election and Ethics Committee, where he led the implementation of Prop 2, which expanded early voting, absentee ballot tracking, and a drop box requirements. So please welcome the panel and be prepared for questions when we're ready. Turn it over to Senator Moss.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. You're in the right place to talk about 2024. I don't think any other state was as scrutinized as Michigan was in 2020. And certainly a lot of the focus was here in the city of Detroit. So I'm grateful to have this esteemed panel join me up here. But Senator Chang and I have been in the trenches on this issue for a while. So in the Michigan Senate, as was alluded to in the previous presentation by Attorney General Dana Nessel, it didn't take until the Saturday after the Tuesday election in 2020 for the Republican majority to convene an oversight committee to examine potential fraud that had happened in our 2020 election. And they went through this exhaustive exercise in Michigan, calling in witnesses for months and months and months, and ended up in the spring of 2021 coming out with a report that affirmed that there was no systemic fraud in our elections, that the results were fair and accurate. And nevertheless, as Senator Chang and I were kind of relieved that this hunt for information affirmed what we knew all along, the majority then introduced about 38 or 39 bills in the Michigan legislature to change voting based on those claims of fraud that they had debunked, including restricting access to how you register to vote, restricting access to how you request an absentee ballot, restricting ID use, restricting how the votes are tallied and how even drop boxes could be used. And so the following year, none of those bills all passed in the legislature, but our governor vetoed all of them. And then the following year, our citizens gathered together and put together a ballot proposal in 2022, which affirmed access to voting rights. It was Prop 2, it was called Promote the Vote, and it included things, the hallmark of the proposal was 9 days of early voting in Michigan. We were not a part of the other states that had early voting. So we were tasked as the Senate Elections Committee to implement the laws around early voting and also permanent absentee ballot access, guaranteed drop box, paid postage, expanding options for voter IDs. So we've been kind of whiplashed back and forth in the Michigan legislature from one end to the other. And so this is a perfect opportunity to talk about all of the things that a state like Michigan has done in terms of voter access, but also the trends on the other side of other states that have kind of restricted access to voting in the wake of 2020. So I want to lead off with Ian McDougall, because Ian, I know many of you are covering elections in this highly scrutinized atmosphere. that we have. And Ian is with LexisNexis and has an incredibly powerful database resource that all of you should be familiar with, so that you can kind of understand, as you're covering various states, where's the one-stop shop you can go to kind of comprehend what each state is doing. So I'm going to turn it over to Ian as we get out of the way here to kind of walk through what LexisNexis is doing and the tools and resources that it can provide you to understand what states are doing in terms of their voting access laws.
Thank you very much. I was going to make a comment about how American my accent is, but you've already been tipped off that I've come from London, so that fell by the wayside. Just before I talk about the main topic here, what I thought it might be helpful to do is to give you a bit of background as to why this is happening, where it comes from. So you've heard that I am lucky enough to be president of the LexisNexis Rule of Law Foundation. For the last 20 years I've worked for Lexis and will be until September the General Counsel for LexisNexis. And so our work on the rule of law is very, very long-standing. What we do as a foundation is we engage in advocacy and projects around the world which are designed to advance the rule of law as we define it there. They are the four principles of the rule of law. And I just want to point out, in case there are those of you looking at it think, hang on, it doesn't include X, whatever X might be in your own particular view of what the rule of law is. But what we did was we didn't sit in a room and decide what we thought the rule of law should be. What we did was we undertook some extensive research over many months back through history to look at what different societies around the world had told us the rule of law meant. So this was looking at things like the Hammurabi Code, 2500 BC, or the Upanishad writings of Hindu philosophy, Islamic scholarship through the Middle Ages, Magna Carta, various kind of elements that would try to produce the most socio-economically neutral version of the rule of law possible in order to be able to advance that around the world in all kinds of different socio-economic political environments. This is the four-point definition. Transparency of law, which I'll get to in a minute for obvious reasons, equality for everybody under the law, an independent judiciary, and access to remedy. Now, the important thing, of course, in our engagement and advocacy on the rule of law around the world is that a very, very extensive World Justice Project Rule of Law Index, which has been going for a number of years now. It takes them 2 years to update it because it's over about 3,000 different measures of elements that feed into those four things in 140 countries. And the majority of those countries around the world have had rule of law declining over the past 5 years for different reasons. Well, our job is to try to advance the rule of law, and to do so in a way that will encourage every country, no matter what its political system, to adopt these principles. So that was the summary, basically the summary of the rule of law. What we did as a project, because of the controversy that surrounded elections and people perhaps not understanding what the rights are connected to voting in the United States, we decided to put this tool together. As I say, we are a charity, so we rely upon volunteers, and the way that we have done this prior to the charity was that it was LexisNexis Corporate Social Responsibility Program, as it used to be called. I think ESG is the modern phrase. And our involvement was to say, let's take the enthusiasm and core skills of the employees of LexisNexis and devote them to doing projects which advance one or more of those four principles of the rule of law. Then we established the foundation at the beginning of 2019 in order to have a focal point, a non-charity registered in the United States, a non-profit registered in the United States to do those projects. So, using volunteers, this is what we decided to do, to create a tool that will enable you, anyone else, because it's free, to have a look at what the voting laws are in each state, state by state, and also to compare the laws in states, as I say, to give you a good and easy way to do that. I mention again, it's a free resource, 40,000 voting and election laws with real-time updates. So it's actually not only the law, but it's also laws which are currently being considered by state legislatures. So of course they may change by the time they actually get passed, but they're included as well. You can see from that little diagram there that you can kind of hover your mouse over the top of each state, and it will give you some introductory information about it for you to then be able to drill down as far as you want to be able to go, both legislature and case law, in respect of all the different elements of the voting law in that state. If I go on again, that's a bigger version of the same thing. Another thing that I should add as well is that we use artificial intelligence in order to produce and capture very easy to understand summaries of the legislation that you'll be looking at. So again, it's designed to make this, as per our principle of the rule of law, as transparent as possible in your use. The ability to drill down, separate it, enacted laws, recently enacted laws, there's all kinds of subdivisions that you can do, and I can give you lots of different examples. Funny little story, actually. Originally, before this was released, it said 51 states, and I said, hang on a minute, that's an interesting number, isn't it, in the United States? So, I mean, unless, Canada is now, but anyway, so we did get it changed to 50 states plus the District of Columbia, and so on. You can isolate the particular state that you want to look at. If you don't want to compare, you just want to drill down into a particular state. This one is obviously highlighting Michigan. I will briefly be able to do that. This is something where this is a search result. I realise you can't read that, but it's basically highlighting the results of a search that someone has done in respect of Michigan law. So then when you click, I believe that the next slide is going to be us clicking on the fourth one down here. That takes you then to the particular piece of legislation that you are researching, and so on. This is an ability to compare legislation across the states. You choose which states you want to compare and the particular types of categories you want to compare them with, and it will do that for you. I would emphasize as well that this is extensively aligned with our view that to advance the rule of law around the world, what we try to do is to be totally apolitical. This is not a commentary on the merits of the law. This is simply a statement of what the law is. We're a non-political organisation, and I hope that's part of the power of what we do. Again, some graphics for you to have a look at, but ultimately I think this is just, the point is that if you go to the site itself, spend some time, have a play around, there's lots of functionality there, lots of ability for you to drill down on particular aspects, and also in search boxes as well for you to ask natural language questions. So you don't have to do some kind of special search. The artificial intelligence idea behind it is that you can ask a natural language search and it will produce some responses for you in respect of the particular question that you have. We recently added court opinions to this. It was originally just legislation, but there are now court opinions. And again, to help your use, to help speed up what you do, there are case summaries which help you to understand what the case is all about without you having to read, 250 pages of judge-made law. So I think that's it. That's really all I wanted to say. There's lots of things you can do, and it just depends upon how much you want to look into the particular question. There is also something that would be very helpful for us, which is there is a feedback opportunity there. So please do feel free to send feedback. And just so that you know where that feedback goes, it isn't some name sort of faceless corporation stuff going on here. There are some examples of the actual volunteers. When you give feedback about this, it goes to these people who have given up their free time in order to be able to produce this stuff using the Lexis resources that we've made available. One last thing I would say is that it certainly shows you the power of the feeling amongst the Lexis folks about their commitment to advancing the rule of law right around the world. We've done so far over 100 projects in 30 countries around the world. This is one of them in this particular country. So with that, I just thought I'd give you that introduction, and thank you very much.
All right, great. That's an incredible resource, not just for you in the media, but for us as lawmakers as we're looking at what other states are doing. So, we'll have set aside time for Q&A if you have more questions about this platform, but that's incredibly useful. We will turn it off so we're not blinding colleagues up here. So that's a resource, but let's talk about how you would utilize this. What are the trends going on around the country? As I mentioned, Michigan headed in one direction in 2021. We headed in a total opposite direction of voter access and early voting and increased access to absentee ballot. So my question for Sean is, what are the trends going on around the country? You have 50 states with very vastly different approaches to election law, and this election will probably come down to a handful of states. What are the trends going on around the country in terms of more increased voter access to, on the other end of the spectrum, tightening up some of the voter laws in those states?
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. 50 states and DC. So I'll start by giving a very brief introduction about the Brennan Center, although I know many of you are already aware of us and what we do, but I'm the director of the Voting Rights Program at the Brennan Center. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit law and policy center. We're affiliated with NYU School of Law. We have offices in New York and DC. Our mission is to protect, defend, and improve our systems of democracy and justice. I obviously am focused on the democracy part of that. We take a sort of multi-pronged approach to that mission. We do research and policy development. That's sort of our think tank function. We take that policy and we try to go get it enacted into law in places like Michigan State Legislature, and advocacy to elected officials, election officials, and executive branch officials, lawmakers, policymakers of all kinds. We then sometimes have to go to court to defend those policies or to fight back against bad policies. And so we have a sort of public interest law firm function. And lastly, and probably most importantly for this audience, we view ourselves as a communications hub. We are trying to impact the public narrative and conversation and inform both the media and the public writ large about the issues that we work on. We believe that if we're going to change outcomes in state legislatures and in courts, we also need to have an impact in the court of public opinion. And so to that end, one of the things that we have done, and to get to the question that's been posed, is since 2011, we've been tracking every piece of voting legislation in every state around the country. And we haven't provided this amazing public-facing resource that LexisNexis is now provided, but internally we've been tracking that legislation now for more than a decade and coding all of those pieces of legislation as either restrictive, that is restricting access to voting, expansive, expanding access to voting. More recently, since 2020, we created a new category of election interference legislation, so laws that increase the risk of partisan interference in our elections. And then we regularly report on that through our voting laws roundup and sort of identify the trends of what we're seeing develop. So the longer term, the reason we started doing this back in 2011 is that we started seeing a huge wave of restrictive voting laws passed in state legislatures after the 2010 elections. That kind of was maybe supercharged after a Supreme Court decision in 2013, where as many of you likely know, the Supreme Court in the Shelby County case decided that basically put an end to pre-clearance under the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So jurisdictions that were previously had a history of race discrimination in voting had been subject to pre-clearance, had to run all of their changes in their voting laws and policies and practices by the federal government to ensure they were non-discriminatory before putting them into effect. The Supreme Court decision put an end to that, at least for the time being. And so we saw many of these states begin passing new restrictive voting laws once they were allowed to. In fact, the state of Texas had passed a law back in 2011, a restrictive voter ID law, the most restrictive voter ID law in the country, but had been blocked through the pre-clearance process. And the day after the Shelby County decision, Texas announced they were going to put that law into effect, and that sort of began this torrent of new restrictions. So since the Shelby County decision, we've seen over 100 restrictive voting laws passed in states around the country. More recently, post-2020, we saw an even larger wave of restrictive voting laws in many, many states. Senator already made reference to laws passed here in Michigan that were vetoed, but we saw many laws take effect post-2020. And so as of our last roundup, which was effective as of May 3rd of this year, we found that in at least 21 states, there will be new restrictions in effect that weren't in effect in the 22 elections. And in at least 28 states, there are restrictions in effect that voters did not face as of the last presidential election in 2020. So voters are headed into a different set of rules in 2024 than they faced the last time they voted.
What are some of the themes of those restrictions?
Yeah, that has been, the themes echo the lies that we've already talked a fair amount about today. The biggest theme is perhaps in response to the most frequent lie that we heard about the 2020 elections, which is that there's some problem with mail voting, that mail voting is rife with fraud, which is of course untrue, but we've seen many of these new restrictions passed target mail voting, make it harder for voters to cast ballots by mail. Another theme in the lies that are told about our elections, frankly, is racism and xenophobia. So we often hear, I mean, we're here in Detroit, when you think about the lies that were told about 2020, where the fraud supposedly was taking place, of course it's not reflective of any real set of facts or events, but there's a different trend that seemed to have animated the lies, and that is the fraud took place in Detroit, it took place in Milwaukee, it took place in Philadelphia, it took place in Maricopa County, Arizona, in Harris County, Texas. The theme is large concentrations of people of color. That's where the lie is told about fraud, and it's appealing to a sense of xenophobia among voters. And so another recent trend in these restrictive laws, this is just in the last year or two really grown, is states considering legislation to ban non-citizens from voting in our elections, which is of course ridiculous because non-citizens are already not allowed to vote in our elections. It is already a crime in all 50 states and DC, and a federal crime for non-citizens to register or to vote in state or federal elections. And so we really see these laws trying to sort of appeal to and mimic or follow on the lies that were told in all of the legislation that was, or the litigation that was filed in the wake of the 2020 election, and everything that's been spread since then. And one interesting thing we did with our voting laws roundup is we actually, I think we asked, where are these laws being introduced? Who are they being introduced by? And I think for many people, the assumption is this is a purely partisan thing happening, that one party's introducing the restrictive bills and one party's introducing the expansive bills. But there are actually many Republican legislators around the country that aren't introducing restrictive voting legislation, and many that are, and we wanted to know what is driving this, and we did a statistical analysis of all the legislation in 2021 and found that restrictive voting provisions are most likely to be introduced by legislators who represent the whitest districts of the most diverse states in the country. They're also most likely to be introduced by legislators who represent the districts with the highest levels of racial resentment. And so we're hearing the lie that sort of has these dog whistles appealing to people's sense of xenophobia and racism. We're seeing legislators introduce legislation in a way that is reflective of a sort of racial threat theory, that people are scared of people of color exercising political power and responding through these laws. And then we actually see it in the effects that the laws produce. This will be no news to some of you. I'm looking at Taylor, but the Texas legislature passed a bill in 2021, an omnibus bill called SB1 that follows many of these trends that I'm mentioning, lots of attacks on mail voting. And we and others have demonstrated the disparate impact that has had on voters of color. One of the things the bill did is really went after assistance, and this is another theme that we've seen around the country, assistance for voters. Voters under federal law, under the Voting Rights Act, are entitled to assistance either because they have a disability that prevents them from reading the ballot or because of language access issues. So if you target language assistance in a state like Texas, I think we can all guess who that ends up impacting and who that makes it harder to vote. It is by and large Latino and Asian American voters. So that's the themes on the negative side. And I've gone on for a while, but I do want to quickly mention the reverse side of things. We've also
like
seen,
Michigan.
Yes, exactly. While in Michigan, I want to say Michigan, I think, is a good example of a trend of even more, since 2020, even more expansive legislation passed around the country than restrictive legislation, by and large in different states, unfortunately. And so you see these divergent trends, and you see how much access you have to voting as a voter dependent more and more on where you live. But I think Michigan is an interesting story because it shows what happens when voters turn out and vote for an expansive democracy. I think we've seen voters care more and more about the way democracy works in recent years. This has really moved to the center of the political conversation across the country. And Michigan voters, from when we started tracking expansive legislation in 2013 up until 2018, there were no expansive bills passed out of the Michigan State Legislature. There were some restrictive bills that ended up getting vetoed in some circumstances, but no expansive bills passing, not very much happening on the restrictive side either. A lot of gridlock, frankly, on this issue. Voters came out in 2018 in the state of Michigan and passed constitutional amendments and ballot measures that expanded access to voting, created things like automatic voter registration, and changed the way redistricting worked in the state of Michigan to make it more independent, to push back against partisan gerrymandering. And then again, in 2022, voters turned out and passed another set of reforms that expanded access to voting and cleaned up and protected against election interference. So voters were saying very loudly to their lawmakers, this is what we want. We want an expansive democracy. We want free and fair elections. And lo and behold, the first legislature to be elected under that new way of drawing maps, and the first legislature to hold office after hearing this message from the Michigan voters, passed more expansive legislation than any other state legislature in the country in 2023. Of the 53 expansive laws passed in 2023, 12 of them were passed out of the Michigan State Legislature. And so I think Michigan is somewhat unique in the way this all developed, but there have actually been a lot of ballot initiatives in a lot of states around the country where voters have come out and very clearly expressed their desire for a more expansive democracy. And in states where the legislature hasn't necessarily been listening yet, I worked very hard on a ballot measure in 2018 in Florida to restore voting rights to people with felony convictions. And in Florida, in 2018, more than 1 million voters there were 1 million more votes cast in favor of that ballot initiative than in favor of Ron DeSantis for governor. It was 65% of the Florida electorate voted for Amendment 4. So I think we're hearing a message from voters, and in some places we're starting to see lawmakers respond to that, and other places, unfortunately, we're seeing the opposite.
I'll build off of that as well. So in Michigan, that pro-voter, promote the vote ballot proposal in 2018, it was promote the vote 1 in 2018, passed with 66% of the vote. And then given all of the scrutiny and all of the rhetoric and all of the attention on Michigan in 2020, voters came together in 2022 to pass promote the vote 2 with 60% of the vote. And in Michigan, you don't get to 60% of the vote with Democrats or liberals alone. That's a coalition of Democrats, Republicans, and independents who wanted to back away from the misinformation and join other states that had early voting and other provisions that provided more access to the ballot. So I chair the elections committee in the Michigan Senate. Senator Chang is a member of that committee, and we've done a lot of this work to implement that proposal 2 and more. And one of the things that we worked on for the last several years is modernizing the way that our 70-year-old recount law exists in Michigan. And I use that as an example because even though we've kind of gotten away from the conspiracies and away from the lies, in fact, in one of our committees, we did an exhaustive testimony from our election administration officials, from the County Clerks Association to the Municipal Clerks Association to the Secretary of State, and we have this naysayer who comes to all of our committees to, talk about fraud and talk about conspiracies, and she was about to rebut everything that our election administrators had just testified, and she sat down at the microphone in our committee and she said, "You know what? I never heard about it expressed this way before. I got to rethink my opposition to this." So truth actually kind of works in this system. So we passed a recount law, but still faced some of the same rhetoric and misinformation and outright lies. And Senator Chang and I have been working to correct that misinformation. So that's kind of a question of, use that as an example of responsible reporting. We've passed a bill, we're still dealing with the same misinformation. How are we as legislators working to uplift the truth, and how are we working with media in terms of making sure that the truth is reported on a bill like that?
Yeah, great question. Also, just thanks for the opportunity to be here, and huge thanks to Senator Moss for his leadership on this committee. So just by way of backdrop on why are we talking about a recount law in Michigan? So for years, Michigan has had a really weird, there's just no other way to say it, but just a weird recount law that doesn't match the rest of the country, where and the way that I first learned about this was in 2017. There was a Detroit City Clerk race that was very, very close. And actually, so our current Lieutenant Governor, he challenged the current and then City Clerk, and it was a pretty close margin. He asked for a recount. And it turns out that actually about a third of the precincts that he asked to be recounted could not be recounted under Michigan law, because right now, under Michigan law, until this law takes effect, basically if the number of ballots in the box is off, even by 1 or 2, any small number, from what the number of signatures are on that poll book, you can't recount that entire precinct. So there were, I think, 33 to 30-something precincts that he had asked to be recounted that basically could not get recounted because of that. And we looked at the numbers, and they were all off by like less than 10 votes. And when you talk to elections inspectors, and also when you just think about this logically, there's human error that happens, right? So there are people that go in, maybe they're in the wrong polling location, the poll worker forgot to cross their name off, or the person walked in and just for whatever reason walked out of the polling location without actually having turned in their ballot. This happens, unfortunately, somewhat frequently, but usually it's by a small number per precinct. The other thing that happens is that in Michigan, all of these ballot boxes are required to be secure, right, with some type of container. And in Michigan, a lot of clerks use these zip ties, which we have heard from our colleague, former Warren City Clerk Paul Voyno, that these zip ties are not the best, right? They're just like any other type of zip tie. They can break, right? And so, but So what we worked on was making sure that we're actually getting to the point of an actual recount, which is recounting all of those ballots, which is the whole point of a recount. But along with that, we worked with county clerks, the Secretary of State, a number of voting rights organizations to look at everything else in the recount law that we could modernize and make more sense of. And so it was a big overhaul, really to just bring our state's recount law in line with really what the rest of the country is doing, and also making sure that we have the proper procedures in place. So in the massive overhaul, there were a couple of things that led to just like widespread misinterpretation from the other side. And one of the things that we had done was make it clear that a recount is not an investigation of fraud. Because it's not. It never has been. A recount is literally retabulating the ballots. But in the law prior to this change, the wording was such that you had to, in order to petition for a recount, you had to believe by fraud or mistake that something had happened, and then therefore you were asking for a recount. I mean, if you think about this, most people who ask for a recount are actually just asking for a recount because they know the numbers are really close. They're not exactly sure what happened, but they just want a recount. And so we thought, well, this isn't exactly what a recount is supposed to be, using those words fraud or mistake, so why don't we make it actually a broader term that encapsulates any possible reason? And so we replaced the words fraud or mistake with the word error. So then, one of our colleagues picks up on this.
That's the foundation.
Yes,
for all of
that's like we're actually trying to make it easier for people to recount. But with that wording change, one of our colleagues sort of latched onto this and said, "Oh, so you're going to make it so that you can't do a recount if you believe there was fraud," which is just completely false. But then all these press statements started going out. And of course, she also made these comments throughout the committee hearing, and then even after the passage of this law, and after the governor signed this law, then we started seeing these news headlines, unfortunately, from, I think, mostly smaller papers that probably saw a press release and didn't have a lot of the capacity to do the follow-up. And we're just running articles saying that we were making it so you couldn't recount if there was allegations of fraud. So two things about that. Really grateful to the reporters who reached out to both of us to say, this doesn't seem right because I read the law and this does not line up with what someone said. Can you please clarify? So we talked to a couple of reporters, some of you might be in this room, not actually sure, who asked, can you just clarify this and do a fact check? And so we were able to then actually say, like, no, actually we're trying to make it easier to do a recount. We're trying to clarify that a recount is not an investigation of fraud. If you want to investigate fraud, you're supposed to actually go to your law enforcement. Our Attorney General, the FBI, the state police have all actually undergone those types of investigations, and our law enforcement who are equipped and trained to investigate. Our county boards of canvassers, this is just not their job. And when it comes to the point of a recount, their job is to recount the ballots. So we really try to really do that fact check. And so I think it was a really great example of great journalism and being able to actually look at the bill and then call the sponsors of the legislation and say, is this actually true? So I was really grateful that folks reached out to that. Unfortunately, we're still combating some of that misinformation, but I think that, I hope that this is a sign that, hopefully there will be more and more of that fact checking happening.
Yeah, I mean, this is an example of kind of the atmosphere that we're in. We had a colleague who claimed that we were removing fraud as a reason for recount, and there were tweets on that got millions of views. And it left us as lawmakers trying to figure out how to catch up with that. And we're grateful for responsible reporting. AP did a huge fact check article on this, and we were able to kind of pump that out. So it's just something that we're all gonna have to be vigilant about, where they pick at little parts of laws that are moving forward and still trying to attach it to a 2020 narrative. Looking at 2020 and the post-election process, how prepared are we for 2024? What are states doing in preparation for the post-election process? The federal government passed an Electoral Count Reform Act, We in Michigan actually adopted those timelines to ensure that, there's no space for a fake slate of electors. Only the governor of Michigan calls for the Electoral College to meet. Only the governor of Michigan signs the certificate that goes to Congress. So I think back to Sean, what are states doing in preparation for not just voting access and voting rights, but this post-election process? Because it's going to be a frenzied time for all of us once the polls close to catch up with everything that happens between 8 p.m. on Election Day, the Electoral College meeting, and then January 6, 2025.
It's a great question. I think, the first thing for everyone to know, and you probably already knew, you mentioned, is that Congress passed the Electoral Count Reform Act. And so at a federal level, we have more clarity on the way that this process is supposed to play out for presidential elections. That the previous Electoral Count Act had been in effect for a very long time and was written in a sort of arcane and somewhat vague way, and that was one of the things that former President Trump tried to take advantage of when making his pushing forward a completely wild legal theory as to what could happen. But because of some of those vagaries, they were able to, have something to point to in justifying those completely baseless theories. So that's the first thing. A number of states have responded by passing state laws that sort of mirror the requirements of the ECRA to make sure that states are on the same calendar that the ECRA provides for. I think New York has a bill that is awaiting the governor's signature that does that, for example. The other thing that states have done and that Michigan did, I think Michigan voters did, is sort of clarify the way that election certification is supposed to function. Election certification, by and large, is a ministerial, non-discretionary thing that election officials are supposed to do. Some of my colleagues actually wrote a law review article about this, if you want to read a law review article, about the long history of election certification, why it exists. But mostly, election officials are just certifying the results that they have determined. It isn't sort of like a moment to have, I think the Attorney General referenced this earlier, like a sort of gut check on, do I think this seems right? It's, just certifying the numbers that have been tabulated. I think that there have been some attempts since 2020 by election officials here and there around the country to claim otherwise about the way election certification functions, and they have refused to certify in places like a random county in New Mexico or a county in Pennsylvania. I think that this isn't state lawmakers making a change, but the courts have responded to those attempts exactly the way that they should. In New Mexico, the Secretary of State brought a mandamus action, so a lawsuit basically saying you have no choice but to certify, and the court said, yeah, that's right, you have no choice but to certify. And those kinds of things have played out in a number of different jurisdictions around the country in a way that I think will be helpful to us in the post-election period in 2024. I think it's important for reporters heading into that election to know there are going to be election officials who refuse to certify. And this isn't a where there's smoke, there's fire situation. Unfortunately, in 2024, when an election official refuses to vote for certification, that doesn't mean that there was some kind of fraud or something else going on. A lot of times it just, the recent years have shown us, just means that they literally, I think the election official in New Mexico in 2020 said it's just a gut feeling, right? And we should expect, based on what we've seen in 2022, state courts to swiftly respond to that and mandate certification happen. And so it's important as those sort of disputes develop for the reporting on it to be clear about what's happening and what's not, and what people can glean from this. And I think we all probably need to be prepared for that going into the election so that it doesn't contribute to the kind of mayhem post-election. But the other thing that some states have done, and I'm mindful of time, I'll stop, is changed their laws about mail ballots and how they're counted and when they're counted and how they're processed. Because I think in 2020 we all saw how states that hadn't previously had large amounts of mail voting, then during a pandemic had large amounts of mail voting, and they had rules that required them to wait until after Election Day to begin processing and tabulating those ballots, and that led to a delay in when we got results. And I think a number of states since then have changed their rules in order to.
That's one of the first things we did in Michigan. I think you can draw a line between the time it took to process those absentee ballots in Michigan to people wanting to stop the count, to the fake slate of electors saying there was fraud, to January 6th. There's a direct line between absentee ballot processing and January 6, 2021. So one of the first things we did is we joined the 38 other states that allow for pre-processing of absentee ballots as they come in.
Yeah, and New York did the same thing, a number of other states did. Unfortunately, there are some states that haven't, so like Pennsylvania has not entirely fixed this problem because of gridlock there. So there will still be some places where we see some struggle with the timing of counting and tabulation. And frankly, there are voter protective mechanisms in law that mean that you don't have all of the ballots as to count or counted as polls are closing because people mailed their ballot in on time but it hasn't yet arrived, for instance, or there's some minor error or omission on a ballot and people are given a notice of that and an opportunity to cure that defect. Those are things we should all want, but they do mean that if in a really, really close election, you may not be able to have the final results immediately after the election. So it won't completely do away with the delay after poll close, but I think it will go a long way and to having earlier results, which then prevents against the kind of misinformation and disinformation that we saw in 2020.
And you can use LexisNexis to find out which states have those processes post-election shored up. I think we're ready for Q&A.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Brandon Tinsley with Capital B News. I'm wondering if anyone on the panel or several of you on the panel can talk about maybe the state and future of like state voting rights acts. I think Minnesota most recently enacted one, but especially since the major Alabama Supreme Court case last summer, it seems like there's been sort of a fresh attack on Section 2 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And so like how are states actually what are they doing to sort of like protect that private right to action and things like that?
So, yeah.
Let's field it we are working on it in Michigan, and we actually have, we're on the precipice of passing a Voting Rights Act in Michigan, which both Senator Chang and I have sponsored pieces of that. So why don't you talk about it?
Yeah, for sure. It's a
Especially
team
as it relates
effort.
to,
Yep.
communities
Language
of color
access.
being targeted, et cetera.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. And I think that it actually speaks to there I think is this growing sentiment across the country that we need to do more to actually protect our voting rights. And we know that court decision, I guess 11 years ago now, had a huge impact on the rest of the country. So what can we do at the state level to actually enshrine some of these voting rights and actually even expand on some of what's in the VRA? So want to give a huge shout out to Senator Darren Camilleri, who is the lead on this package. Senator Moss and myself and Senator Erica Geis have all teamed up to be part of this. It's a 4-bill package for our Michigan Voting Rights Act. And there's sort of a number of pieces in it. One of the pieces is actually around sort of kind of pre-clearance in that, creating a process by which citizens can actually file a complaint with the state if they believe that a law or an ordinance or a process that's happening in their area is actually violating their voting rights, and ensuring that we're giving our state the authority to actually oversee what those changes should be if there is discrimination happening. There is also the creation of the institute, an election institute at a university, which I think will be really exciting.
One-stop shop for election data here in the state of Michigan. Instead of having to FOIA 83 counties in Michigan for that information, you can actually go to one of our universities, which will have all of this publicly available.
And then my piece in this is around language access, which we hope to really try to give greater ability for voters who are limited English proficient to be able to exercise their right. At the federal level, the federal VRA does include some language access, but does not include Arabic or several other languages. And then also, we believe that we should actually, once we need to sort of create this institute first, but hopefully 5 years later down the line, actually even lower the population threshold so that we're providing language access to greater numbers. Detroit's a perfect example. You know, our Latino population and our Bengali population don't quite meet the thresholds of the VRA, yet they are huge neighborhoods of voters who really would be able to vote if we just lowered the threshold by a bit. So we are eager to do that. And then also creating greater access for voters with disabilities. So again, giant team effort. The bills are out of committee, and we were going to vote on them the last day of session.
You don't want to hear that story.
Anyway.
Ian, yeah.
Yeah, there's another facility that the Voting Rights Center provides, and that's not with regard to different languages, but it's actually understandability of the English language text. And how simple the language is to understand. And I have, as I have two legislators in the room, if I can just make a pitch to consider the complexity of language used, the simplicity of language used, to help people actually understand what the legislation is intending to do. It is very easy in certain professional contexts to fall into jargon. And then, of course, you need another 16 pages of definition to explain what the jargon is, when in fact using plain language would have solved the problem in the first place.
Point well taken.
Yeah, Stu Whitney with South Dakota News Watch. Hearing some of the reforms and some of the voting expansion laws that have been passed in Michigan, it sounds like, or it is, a tale of two states compared to what we're dealing with, covering some of the developments in South Dakota. Definitely the trend is toward restrictions in South Dakota. They've banned drop boxes. They've restricted mail-in voting. They've gone to post-election audits that are mandatory hand counting rather than machines. When you talk, and these are not just zealots, these are significant public officials that are talking about the reasoning for that, about their theory is that during the COVID pandemic, certain progressive groups use that as sort of an excuse to, and some of it obviously warranted, to expand voting laws, but that, or voting access, but that should have gone, that should have been a temporary thing during the pandemic. This is what South Dakota public officials are saying. So I wanted to get your take on that. And I also wanted to get your take on this contention that they have about machine voting. Even though many of them are not even plugged into the internet, they're claiming that they can be hacked by foreign entities or domestic entities, and so they want to go to strict hand counting despite the obvious logistical challenges to that. Thank you.
Yeah, I was leading off with mail-in voting. Mail-in voting became popularized during the Civil War. This is not a new concept in our country, allowing soldiers to be able to vote in the elections that happened during that period of time. So, you know, this is something that is a long tradition in American history, and is something that we take seriously here in Michigan. And part of that proposal that was passed by voters, because our legislature was heading in the other direction, includes permanent access to absentee ballots. So previously in Michigan, prior to 2018, you either had to be a certain age and older, or you had to literally say your excuse as to why you needed an absentee ballot. Either you were out of the community or a whole list of reasons. 2018 in Michigan, that ballot proposal, that first round of voter access ballot proposal, made it so you do not have to list a reason in Michigan about why you want to request an absentee ballot. It is available and accessible for everybody. That passed in 2018. There was no prediction that we would not be able to have predicted that in 2020. That was the way that everyone voted in the state of Michigan. So yes, we had a record amount of absentee ballots, mail-in ballots. And so in 2022, voters here in Michigan went a step further and said, you can, instead of having to apply for an absentee ballot and send in an application and get the ballot mailed to you, you can put yourself on a permanent list so that in every election in the state of Michigan, you will be mailed a ballot to your household if you sign up on that list once. So we are really leaning into mailing voting. here in our state. And as an ancillary to that, we have in that ballot proposal required drop boxes, one for every 15,000 voters in a community, one drop box. So this is something that we've leaned into. Obviously, the pandemic was very illuminative of how easy it was to vote and how convenient it was to vote by mail. And this is something that we've moved forward with. And I know that that's been the point of contention across the country, but we're obviously parading here in Michigan that mail-in voting and absentee voting and voting from home works.
Yeah, I think there's some logical issues with the argument being made that it was the pandemic that was responsible for many of these expansions. There certainly were instances in which expansions happened during 2020, but there were a lot of states, Michigan included, that were making those moves prior to 2020. There was already a sort of trend towards expanding access to mail voting, but also that logic doesn't really justify a state actively restricting access to voting post 2020, and going back to restricting things that predated the pandemic. So I think that I get why people use that rhetoric to justify what they're doing, but I frankly don't think it makes a whole lot of sense, and there's some pretty big logical leaps involved in that argument that don't make a lot of sense. On the second point about hand counting and machine risks with machine hacking, that sort of thing, I do think there are serious concerns that we should all share about cyber security and potential for election interference, but I think that the policies that you were referencing are not really addressing the areas for concern or being realistic about the areas of concern. So there was a time in the not so recent past where there were a lot of jurisdictions around this country that used voting machines that did not create a paper trail, and there have been issues with machines that have cybersecurity vulnerabilities, and so you'd have to worry about some hack or something changing. I think Secretary Johnson yesterday talked about this heading into the 2016 election. Those jurisdictions, by and large, have solved that problem. The vast, vast, vast majority of ballots that are cast in this country, in every part of this country, I don't have the number handy in my head, but it's somewhere like 99% plus, have a voter verified paper record associated with them. And that doesn't just mean casting a paper ballot. It could mean casting a ballot on a machine, which is really important for people with disabilities who aren't able to cast a paper ballot, but that the machine provides the voter with a paper record that they can look at and verify that the paper record matches the vote that they cast. And those paper records provide the ability to do an audit after the fact. An audit is different than doing hand counting of election results. And I think there are very, very tiny jurisdictions in this country that sometimes use hand counts for elections. But in anything above a very tiny jurisdiction, very small number of votes, hand counting is far more prone to mistakes than machine tabulation, and far more likely to lead to problems than machine tabulation. And the jurisdictions, like there was a county in Nevada that tried to do some hand counting in 2022, I think it was Nye County, and they were, during that hand counting process, literally finding like an error rate of 1 out of 4, like just insane error rates. Machine tabulation is far more secure and likely to give you the right results than hand counting. That doesn't mean you can't do hand counts in very small situations as a check. It doesn't mean that you can't audit election results, but there are sort of best practices for doing that, like risk limiting audits, which I think they have here in Michigan, where you take a small sample of the ballots and you audit those, and that sample size is determined by the margin of victory in the election, so you can assure yourself that you're getting enough of a sample where you would catch a problem if there was one. So I think we know how to make our elections secure, and a lot of jurisdictions have headed in that direction in the last few years, and that's why CISA said in 2020 it was our most secure election in our nation's history, and we've only gotten better since then. And Unfortunately, I think some of the folks who claim that they're appealing or they're trying to create more election security are addressing problems that don't really exist. They're finding solutions to problems that don't exist rather than addressing the things that really should be.
Right here.
Quick question, Amy Sherman with PolitiFact. We also fact check the falsehood about the recount law. I wondered for either of the senators, how do you decide when to respond to a falsehood versus just ignoring it? Do you consider if the legislator making it as a backbencher or a leader? Are you looking for a certain viral metric? And then how have you found that any of your efforts to debunk have been successful?
I mean, so I think I got 3 or 4 folks who reached out, and at first I was like, oh my gosh, why do I still have to talk about this issue that is not even an issue? But then then I realized, okay, it actually is very, very important, and rather than having someone who wasn't involved in the process try to answer, it probably is best that I just go ahead and answer. And then after I think 3 or 4, I was like, okay, I told my staff, okay, I'm gonna actually just write something so that we can use this anytime. It wasn't something I thought about at the time of the bill signing that we were going to have to still do this. But I think after a couple of reporters reaching out, I realized, okay, yes, I will do the interviews, and I'm going to actually put a sheet together that we can then use so my staff is also able to answer the questions, because we didn't have that prior, and I'm thinking backwards, I probably should have done that. I just did not know the extent to which this lie was going to go out there.
Yeah, it went viral, and you know, going viral is a product of luck sometimes. And so there was this one election denier type of legislator who just the whole time was talking about this one particular provision of the bill, but it didn't pick up steam in the legislature. It was just a talking point that they used to vote against it. Then he doubled down and made a video, and then the video was picked up by someone else, and then it was reported in the New York Post, and it took off from there, and that was a big challenge. And so I think, you know, we were prepared to just chalk this up to another example of a very fringe member of the legislature just not telling the truth, repeating lies from 2020 all over again, and we wanted to move past it. But it went viral, and that's a product of luck, and we tried to drive a truthful narrative, but really the media was responsible actors in the media contacted us and said, you know, this has picked up steam. We've seen it. We've seen this tweet over and over and over again. What is the validity of it? So it's a partnership between us as lawmakers, but also journalists who want to report the truth and see something that goes viral and just doesn't look right. And it's a lesson for all of us. You don't know which lie is going to pick up steam, and there's going to be a lot heading into the rest of the balance of this year. And so reaching out to the lawmakers who draft the bill is very, very important, rather than just embedding a tweet in an article.
I think we have time for a couple of more. I know Senator Chang has a hard out coming up soon. Binti, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Binti Qureshi with the Washington Examiner. I have a question. It's a technical question for Ian and maybe to a lesser extent, Sean. On your website, you said we could compare states, but can we pick a state and compare it from like today through like 2020 back to like 1996 and 1998? And for Sean, do you guys have a report looking at like how states have voted like before the Shelby ruling and then like after? Just wondering if that's like anywhere on the internet.
Okay, I'll go first. The simple answer is no. What it tells you is the current state of the law. But fantastic feedback. I am going to take it back. If that, I mean, I don't know, I just want to sort of canvass the room. If that's a kind of an important piece of functionality that would be helpful to research, then I can certainly take that back and see if that can be done.
We don't have something that shows how state legislatures were functioning pre-2013 and post-2013 without just kind of going back and looking at our roundups over time, where we have been publishing these things since 2011, so you could get a sense of trends that way. But also, like Ian, I take that feedback and we'll consider doing something like that. What I will say, though, is we have looked at the way voting has functioned in states pre and post Shelby County. We recently put out a report on the racial turnout gap, We spent a lot of our time trying to measure the impact of these policies, and when I'm in court litigating cases like the one in Texas, we're expected to be able to prove the impact of a particular policy. But the reality is that there are so many different policies at play in any given state, and so many other things besides policy at play, like how much money campaigns are investing in a race and whether or not there are candidates of color on the ticket and all kinds of other things that can impact turnout and who's voting and when and all of that, that it can be really hard to isolate the impact of a particular policy. So we decided to take a different approach to looking at this problem, which is to evaluate the sort of symptoms, which is to look at turnout and racial turnout gap. In the Shelby County decision in 2013, I think it's like the second paragraph, Justice Roberts actually says, you know, the reason we know we don't really have this problem with race discrimination in this country anymore is because look at the racial turnout gap in the states that were originally covered by preclearance when the Voting Rights Act passed. We don't see a racial turnout gap anymore, but black voters are voting on par with white voters. And there was a lot of problems with the way that he did that analysis, including the fact that he picked just one election that happened to be the 2012 presidential election, which was the re-election of President Barack Obama. And the data sources and all kinds of other things, but we sort of took him at, you know, we took that point and said, okay, well, let's look at what's happened with the racial turnout gap over time. And what we found is in every state across the country, basically, the racial turnout gap is growing. The racial turnout gap, the gap between the turnout rate for white voters and voters of color is growing across the country. But that since 2013, whereas before 2013, we saw a parallel trend in the way the racial turnout gap went up and down in states that were covered by preclearance and those that were not. Post 2013, the racial turnout gap is growing twice as fast in the jurisdictions that used to be covered by preclearance. And the only thing that changed in those states that didn't change in the rest of the country in 2013 was that they stopped having to submit changes to policy and practice to the federal government to prove that they were not racially discriminatory. And so I think collectively now we know the impact that that change in policy has had, even if we can't isolate one policy change. And it's not all state laws that are changing. State laws are the easy thing to track, but under the preclearance, every movement of a polling place in these jurisdictions had to be run by the federal government to ensure that it wasn't racially discriminatory. Those kinds of local changes are really hard to track and without something like preclearance in effect. And so I think what this study shows is that collectively, the impact of the Shelby County decision has been really significant. But I don't mean to minimize the fact that that gap is still growing across the country, and all these other jurisdictions that weren't subject to preclearance is growing as well. We have a real problem that we should be reckoning with, and I think post-election, a lot of the reporting tends to be, because this is all you can do immediately after election, about top-line turnout numbers. And so we saw in 2022, after the elections, a lot of reporting about how Georgia had high turnout. And then the conclusions that are drawn from that are like, well, maybe SB 202 wasn't really impactful. Maybe all these things Georgia's been doing to try to make it harder for folks to vote don't really matter because they have really high turnout. But you scratch just below the surface, and Georgia had the largest gap between black and white turnout that it had had in a decade. And so I think it's important that we, are careful about the conclusions that we draw immediately following the election, because sometimes the data doesn't allow us to scratch below the surface that way.
Can I do a follow-up? Sorry.
So with Kamala Harris, like, on the precipice of, like, getting the nomination, I know this is, like, forecasting, but do you anticipate more restrictive laws now that we have a visibly black nominee post-Obama?
I mean, it depends on when you mean. I think very little is going to happen in state legislatures between now and the election, because most of them just aren't even meeting. In an even year, by this time of the year, almost every state in the country is kind of not really operating. Michigan is an exception, that there could be activity later in the year, New Jersey, a couple places, but so not a lot between now and the election, I don't expect. I do think that our country has shown that, as I said before, that a lot of times restrictive voting laws and attacks on voting and claims about our elections have a racial element to them, and that there is a lot of evidence that this wave of restrictive legislation is consistent with the idea of racial threat. I don't think it's a coincidence that we first started seeing this wave in 2011, after the 2010 elections, following the election of Barack Obama, right? So Barack Obama was elected in 2008, and then in 2010, there's a sort of backlash in many elections around the country to the election of Barack Obama in 2008, and then those new legislatures that are elected in 2010 start passing a bunch of restrictive voting laws, and that's the first time we saw that was in 2011. And again, it's not a coincidence that we see legislation passing in 2021 that seems to be responding to lies that often have this racialized dog whistle element to them. So will there be a response to another black president similar to the last time around? I mean, I can't tell the future, but I would say that that would be consistent with the way that our nation has operated thus far, sadly. But I will also say that Congress can do a lot about this. And so we had a question about state voting rights acts, and I think state voting rights acts are fantastic, and there's a lot of good work being done. Unfortunately, it's mostly being done in states that weren't subject to preclearance. It's entirely being done in states that weren't subject to preclearance. But Congress could put preclearance back into effect. The court didn't say preclearance was unconstitutional. The court said the formula for determining which parts of the country are subject to preclearance was unconstitutional. And so Congress could pass the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And I think Vice President Harris has been one of the biggest champions of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. She has mentioned it at virtually every speech since she's sort of become the presumptive nominee. She mentioned it long before that. And so will we see a backlash? Yes, possibly. But it's also possible that if you have folks in office that, and I have to be very careful about the way I say this because I'm nonpartisan, but there is a significant portion, there was a majority of support in U.S. Congress in 2021 and 2022 to pass the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, and it is possible for Congress to put an end to this pattern of states restricting access to voting by just setting a nationwide floor for what voting should look like. The Elections Clause of the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the power to overrule what states do when it comes to regulating the time, place, and manner of federal elections, and they could just say, you have to have early voting. You have to have drop boxes. You have to have automatic voter registration. All these things that states like Michigan have been doing are now the law of the land across the country. And so, it's hard to predict what happens in 2025 and beyond. We could see more of what we've seen, but we could also see Congress responding and kind of putting an end to a lot of these trends.
Okay, last one.
Hi, Caroline Cummings. I'm a reporter for WCCO TV and CBS News, Minnesota. Minnesota falls in the expansion of voting rights camp, and we've long had pretty robust access to voting, even before some of the changes in the past couple of years. But I'm wondering, this is for Sean, if you could kind of, in your kind of coding of expansion laws, and I was struck by, election interference laws, maybe on the counterpoint under expansion laws, is that trying to combat election interference. Minnesota passed this law last year, and they doubled down on it this year about targeting artificial intelligence to influence elections. And I'm just curious, how frequently are you seeing that in other states, or are there other laws that kind of fall under that same umbrella of trying to get at the misinformation or targeting of election workers? There was a law to protect election workers that was recently passed. How frequently are you seeing this, and is that kind of the new frontier for expanding election laws beyond just the time, manner, and place of when you can, do your early voting, et cetera?
It's a great question. I would say we have struggled internally with whether or not we want to have a sort of opposite side of the coin category for election interference laws, and we haven't done that thus far because, frankly, it's sort of a weird category to define, like laws that make elections not subject to interference, or kind of just like laws that make our elections work. It's hard to define what's an anti-interference provision, but we have been tracking some of the specific trends that you're talking about. So yes, we have seen states trying to regulate AI in our elections.
Michigan's one of them. And we took Minnesota's as a model. I was actually at a conference of election committee chair people of state legislatures and met the senator and representative from Minnesota. And so what we did here in Michigan is we passed a law that if you're manipulating a video, if you're manipulating a picture, it needs a disclaimer. If you're creating something from nothing, like a recording of Joe Biden that he just never recorded, that's banned. So that's kind of the two-pronged categories on AI that we've tried to tackle.
So as of our last roundup, I think there were 9 states that had passed new laws in 2024 attempting to regulate AI in elections, and many more that had been considering it. That's certainly a trend. Responses to intimidation, harassment, those kinds of things have also been a trend this year. A lot of states have been trying to prevent and add to regulations already in the books to protect election workers and election officials. Right now, the California legislature is considering a bill called the Peace Act, protecting elections. I'm not going to get it right, and I wrote it. So I wrote the model bill that it's based on, so that's my fault. But protecting elections against armed coercion, something like that. The point is, it's a sort of model anti-intimidation bill. Michigan's voters voted a new anti-intimidation provision into the Constitution. There have been a number of examples of this, but the California bill, I think, is sort of combines a number of elements that we've seen in state voting rights acts and other places. And it takes, and this is to the point about how state voting rights acts kind of put some more power in states where the federal government has been lacking. It takes Section 11B of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is maybe the best anti-intimidation provision in the law, and puts it into state law, but then clarifies and makes explicit that it protects election officials and election workers, and then also creates a presumption that if a person who's observing or interacting with protected election conduct, that could be, voting, it could be election administration, it could be all kinds of things, is displaying a firearm, that's presumptively intimidating, so you could win that lawsuit without having to prove anything more than that they had the firearm out in the open. And related to that, a number of legislatures have been passing laws to regulate firearms in our elections. The Michigan legislature, both houses have passed bills to do that. Unfortunately, because of some technical issues, they're not yet law, but they will be, I'm confident. And a number of other states this year, Vermont, Colorado, New Mexico, and Massachusetts last week have all passed laws to prohibit guns around polling places and counting facilities. So yes, I think there are a number of different trends we can point to where states are trying to protect against the types of interference that we saw, the Election Certification and Election Count Reform Act, Electoral Count Reform Act. There are a number of examples of that. We haven't coded those as sort of anti-interference laws, but we have been tracking those trends, and I think Minnesota is illustrative of something bigger happening around the country.
Unfortunately, I have to jump in and shut it down again. Unfortunately, we've jammed a lot of information into this hour and hour plus, but we're really appreciative to the panelists, Senator Moss, Senator Chang, Sean, Ian. Thank you for bringing the resource with you that I believe will be so valuable for these folks to share here. But please give it up for this panel.